The morning of June 7th, 1944, dawned with an eerie quiet near the village of Sainte-Mère-Église in Normandy. But what Obergefreiter Klaus Müller witnessed that day would fundamentally alter his understanding of modern warfare. Müller belonged to the 709th Infantry Division, and he had positioned himself at an observation post overlooking one of the routes leading inland from what the Allied forces designated as Utah Beach. What began as routine surveillance transformed into something that defied his comprehension. Vehicle after vehicle rolled past his position, each one bearing an uncanny resemblance to the last. These weren't the varied assortment of military transports he had expected to see, but rather an endless procession of identical machines, their olive-drab paint gleaming in the early summer light as if they had materialized from thin air rather than crossing an ocean and a channel to reach French soil. For 2 full hours, Müller maintained his count with meticulous German precision. 117 identical military reconnaissance vehicles passed before his eyes during that span. Each appeared to be in pristine condition, unmarred by the supposed rigours of an amphibious invasion. They moved with mechanical regularity, spaced at efficient intervals, driven by soldiers who handled them with a casualness that suggested unlimited availability. This was not the desperate conservation of precious military assets that characterized German operations. This was something entirely different, something that spoke to resources so vast they could be deployed with apparent indifference to loss or damage. The vehicles bore a designation that American soldiers had shortened to a simple 4-letter word that would echo through military history. They called them Jeeps, a name derived from the initials for general purpose, though the official military nomenclature read as Truck, 1/4 ton, 4x4, Command Reconnaissance. But such technical designations failed to capture what these machines represented to the German soldiers who watched them stream inland in numbers that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. What Müller and his comrades were witnessing was not simply an invasion force equipped with motor transport. They were seeing the physical manifestation of an industrial philosophy so fundamentally different from their own that it challenged every assumption about how wars were meant to be fought. The vessels that had delivered these vehicles to the Norman beaches operated with the same industrial efficiency as the Jeeps themselves. Landing ship tanks, those ungainly but remarkably effective vessels designed specifically for beach landings, had crossed the English Channel in convoys that seemed to have no end. Each of these ships possessed the capacity to carry 30 fully assembled Jeeps, complete with fuel, spare parts, and all necessary equipment. The mathematics became staggering when one considered that hundreds of these landing ships were actively engaged in delivering their cargo to the invasion beaches. The Jeeps drove directly off the ship's bow ramps onto French soil, ready for immediate deployment without any need for assembly or preparation beyond starting their engines and pointing them toward the enemy. Manufacturing stamps on these vehicles revealed their origins with bureaucratic precision. Willis Overland Motor Company of Toledo, Ohio, had produced many of them, while Ford Motor Company of Dearborn, Michigan, had manufactured the rest. To the German soldiers examining captured examples or studying them through binoculars, these factory markings represented something far more troubling than mere industrial capacity. They suggested an entire nation mobilized for war production on a scale that rendered conventional military planning obsolete. Germany had converted its automotive industry to military production, certainly, but nothing in the German experience prepared them for what American mass production could achieve when fully committed to a war effort. Hauptmann Werner Lindemann commanded the 3rd Company of the 919th Grenadier Regiment, and his after-action report dated June 9, 1944, captured the growing German bewilderment with stark clarity. Lindemann noted that the enemy possessed vehicles in quantities that German forces reserved for ammunition rounds. Every American unit, extending down to the squad level, appeared to have motorized transport organic to its organization. His report detailed how his company had destroyed 12 of these reconnaissance cars in combat the previous day, a tactical success that should have degraded enemy capabilities. Instead, when Lindemann surveyed the same sector the following morning, he counted 40 of the vehicles operating in the area. The Americans were treating complex military vehicles the way German forces treated rifle cartridges, as expendable items to be used without concern for conservation and replaced without difficulty or delay when lost to combat or mechanical failure. Had German military planners possessed access to the actual production statistics for American Jeep manufacturing, their strategic calculations would have been fundamentally shaken. The period between 1941 and 1945 saw American factories produce more than 640,000 of these vehicles. During peak production periods, the combined output of Willis Overland and Ford reached completion rates of one vehicle every 90 seconds. Assembly lines operated around the clock, with workers changing shifts but production never stopping. This single vehicle type represented fully 1/4 of all American military motor transport production during the war years. Germany, marshalling its industrial resources under constant pressure, had managed to produce barely 50,000 Kübelwagens during the entire conflict. The disparity wasn't merely quantitative, but represented a fundamental difference in industrial philosophy and capability. American production methods achieved something that German engineering culture found almost incomprehensible. Every Jeep, regardless of whether Willis or Ford had manufactured it, utilized completely interchangeable parts. A transmission salvaged from a destroyed Ford GPW could be installed in a Willis MB within minutes by a mechanic with basic tools. Wheels, engines, axles, and even the smallest components like spark plugs and fan belts maintained absolute compatibility across all production runs and both manufacturers. This standardization extended throughout the entire supply system, where spare parts were pre-positioned based on statistical analysis of component failure rates rather than reactive requisitions. The Americans had calculated which parts would fail most frequently under combat conditions and ensured those components were always available in quantities sufficient to maintain operational readiness, regardless of loss rates. Feldwebel Hans Richter of the 716th Static Infantry Division had established an observation position near Carentan, where he could watch American operations without being detected. His diary entries from this period reveal the cognitive dissonance German soldiers experienced when confronting American maintenance practices. Richter wrote that the Americans did not repair their vehicles in the traditional sense. Instead, they simply replaced broken parts with new ones drawn from what appeared to be an endless supply. He had observed a damaged vehicle being restored to full operation in less than an hour through methods that would have been considered wasteful madness in the Wehrmacht. The engine had not been repaired through careful diagnosis and correction of the specific fault. Instead, the entire power plant had been unbolted and lifted out, with a replacement engine installed as casually as a German mechanic might change a tire. German mechanics would require a week to perform such an operation under ideal workshop conditions. The Americans accomplished it in a field, under sporadic artillery fire, while the crew members smoked cigarettes and conversed as if the task required no particular concentration or skill. The German military tradition, built over centuries of professional military service, emphasized the careful preservation and maintenance of every piece of equipment. In the Wehrmacht, vehicles were assigned to specific units and meticulously tracked throughout their entire service lives. Losing a vehicle through negligence or carelessness constituted a court-martial offense that could end a career, or worse. When mechanical problems developed, they were diagnosed with precision and attention to detail. Parts were carefully repaired whenever possible, or manufactured by unit armourers when replacements proved unavailable. The Kübelwagen, which represented Germany's closest equivalent to the American Jeep, required factory-trained mechanics for any maintenance beyond the most basic tasks. Complex repairs necessitated return to depot-level facilities where specialized equipment and expertise were available. American operational principles functioned according to entirely different logic. Army planners had calculated that a Jeep's combat life expectancy averaged 90 days under field conditions. Rather than investing resources in elaborate repair facilities and extended maintenance procedures, they simply manufactured replacement vehicles in quantities that exceeded any possible loss rate. When a Jeep sustained damage beyond immediate field repair, mechanics stripped it of still functional parts and abandoned the hulk. A replacement vehicle would arrive within hours or days, delivered by the endless supply convoys that maintained constant connection between the invasion beaches and the advancing front lines. This approach violated every principle of German military economy, yet its effectiveness could not be denied. Lieutenant Colonel Otto von Schröder served as Chief of Staff of the 352nd Infantry Division, and his correspondence with his wife captured the German bewilderment with particular eloquence. Von Schröder characterized the American approach as fighting a rich man's war, where vehicles were expended with the same casual abundance that German forces reserved for ammunition. He described witnessing a jeep strike a mine, an incident that should have represented a significant loss requiring reports and investigations. Instead, the crew emerged unhurt, transferred their equipment to another vehicle that appeared within minutes as if summoned, and continued their mission without pause. The destroyed jeep was simply pushed to the roadside and forgotten, already replaced in the unit's operational inventory before the smoke had cleared. In the German army, such a loss would trigger reports, investigations, and weeks of bureaucratic effort to obtain authorization for a replacement. The Americans seemed to regard vehicles as consumable supplies rather than capital equipment. By June 10th, American forces had successfully landed more than 12,000 vehicles on the Norman beaches, with jeeps comprising the largest single category in this mechanized armada. These vehicles were transforming the battlefield in ways that German tactical doctrine had not anticipated and could not effectively counter. American reconnaissance units penetrated German defensive lines with unprecedented speed and flexibility, appearing in sectors that should have been secure and gathering intelligence before German reserves could respond. Artillery forward observers operating from jeeps could rapidly relocate after calling in fire missions, making German counter-battery fire nearly impossible to execute effectively. Supply units maintained continuous contact with advancing combat forces, eliminating the natural pauses for consolidation and resupply that German commanders had expected to exploit for repositioning their own forces or launching counterattacks. The jeep's mechanical capabilities compounded German tactical difficulties in ways both obvious and subtle. Its four-wheel drive system and relatively low weight allowed it to traverse terrain that German planners had confidently assessed as impassable for vehicles. The Norman bocage country, with its ancient network of sunken roads bordered by thick hedgerows and earthen banks, should have channeled American vehicles into predictable routes that could be defended or turned into killing zones through prepared positions and pre-registered artillery. Instead, jeeps simply drove through fields, over embankments, and around obstacles that would have stopped conventional vehicles. They created their own road network independent of the mapped routes that German forces had prepared to defend. Defensive positions carefully sited to command key intersections found themselves bypassed by enemies who refused to use the roads at all. Oberst Hans von Luck commanded a battle group of the 21st Panzer Division during the Normandy campaign, and his post-war writings reflected on the impact of American motorization with the perspective of experience and hindsight. Von Luck observed that the Jeep provided every American unit with the mobility that German forces had achieved only with elite mechanized formations. A single vehicle could transport a machine gun team, a mortar crew, communications equipment, or supplies depending on mission requirements. These vehicles appeared everywhere, in places German commanders thought secure, bringing firepower or calling in artillery strikes through their radio equipment. German forces found it impossible to establish a continuous defensive front because American units simply drove around strong points rather than attacking them directly. Static positions could be contained and bypassed, their garrisons left to wither while American forces advanced past them toward more strategic objectives. The maintenance and supply system supporting this mechanized force proved equally overwhelming in its efficiency and scale. American logistics units had prepared for operations calculated in industrial rather than military terms. Ships arrived daily at the invasion beaches carrying not just fuel and ammunition, but entire vehicles, complete spare engines, transmissions, and prepackaged component sets designed for rapid installation. Mobile workshops advanced immediately behind combat units, staffed by mechanics trained in assembly line replacement techniques rather than traditional repair craftsmanship. These workshops possessed the capability to perform any repair or replacement operation required to keep vehicles operational. If a combat unit lost 10 jeeps in a day's fighting, 10 replacement vehicles would arrive within 48 hours as a matter of routine logistics rather than extraordinary effort. Often the replacements arrived even faster, delivered by supply personnel who treated vehicle distribution as they might treat any other commodity. Major Heinrich Zimmermann of the 12th SS Panzer Division found himself studying American supply operations with growing comprehension of their implications. Zimmermann observed that the American logistics system operated like a factory production line that had been extended directly to the battlefield itself. Everything was standardized, packaged according to predetermined specifications, and delivered on schedule as if the entire war were a manufacturing process. They had removed what Clausewitz had famously described as the friction from warfare, all those countless small difficulties and delays that accumulate to degrade military operations. While German forces struggled to maintain their existing equipment through improvisation and careful conservation, Americans simply ordered replacements as if selecting items from a catalogue. The psychological impact of this abundance gradually accumulated until it affected German morale as significantly as any tactical defeat. Within days of the invasion, psychological effects became evident throughout German units facing American forces. Soldiers who had been repeatedly told through propaganda that Americans were soft, dependent on material comfort, and lacking in fighting spirit discovered an enemy who possessed material abundance that exceeded imagination. The sight of endless columns of identical jeeps, each appearing new and fully equipped with all necessary accessories, demoralized troops who were carefully preserving vehicles that had been in continuous service since the Polish campaign of 1939. Mechanics who took pride in keeping ancient vehicles running through skill and improvisation found their accomplishments rendered meaningless by an enemy who could simply discard any vehicle that developed problems and replace it immediately. Gefreiter Wolfgang Braun served as a mechanic with the 21st Panzer Division, and his examination of captured jeeps produced insights that challenged his professional assumptions. Braun reported that every component was designed for mass production and easy replacement rather than longevity or elegance. The engine was simple in design but adequate for its purpose. The transmission was robust rather than refined in its operation. Nothing was polished or precisely fitted in the manner of German automotive engineering, yet everything functioned reliably under field conditions. The Americans had consciously sacrificed elegance for quantity, and quantity was proving to be the decisive factor in modern warfare. The Jeep represented a democratic approach to engineering, designed to be maintained by average soldiers with basic training rather than requiring specialist craftsmen. One aspect of American operations particularly troubled German observers, who had been thoroughly indoctrinated in the racial theories that formed a core element of the regime's ideology. African American soldiers were clearly visible in American motor pools, driving jeeps, maintaining them, and supervising vehicle operations. This reality challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and military effectiveness that formed pillars of the worldview German soldiers had been taught to accept. Feldwebel Kurt Wagner noted with evident bewilderment that Negro soldiers operated and repaired these vehicles with the same efficiency as white soldiers. The racial theories promoted by the regime suggested this should be impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable and unavoidable. German prisoners who passed through American vehicle parks could not help but observe black soldiers performing complex mechanical tasks with obvious competence. American modifications to their jeeps demonstrated operational flexibility that German military culture, with its emphasis on following established procedures and maintaining equipment to precise specifications, could not easily accommodate. Within days of the initial landings, frontline units were welding additional armor plate to vulnerable areas, installing improvised wire cutters to counter German piano wire traps strung across roads at neck height, mounting multiple machine guns in configurations not contemplated by original designs and adapting vehicles for specialized roles as missions dictated. Medical units converted jeeps to ambulances by installing stretcher racks fabricated from whatever materials were available. Signal units loaded them with radio equipment and additional batteries. Engineer units mounted mine detectors and demolition equipment. Each modification was crude by German standards of precision engineering, but immediately effective for its intended purpose. The Americans seemed to view vehicles as platforms for modification rather than finished products to be used exactly as designed. The contrast with German equipment became increasingly stark and demoralizing as the campaign progressed through June and into July. Wehrmacht vehicles required specific fuel grades, specialized spare parts manufactured to tight tolerances, and mechanics trained in their particular systems. Many German units, even in 1944, still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport for moving supplies and artillery. A single German infantry division required thousands of horses that consumed tons of fodder daily. These animals were vulnerable to artillery fire and strafing aircraft, required constant care and veterinary attention, and limited the division's mobility to the walking pace of men and beasts. Watching American units advance at 30 miles per hour in vehicles that required only gasoline and basic maintenance administered by ordinary soldiers was profoundly demoralizing for German troops still dependent on methods of transport that would have been familiar to Napoleon. By June 15th, German intelligence services estimated that American forces in Normandy possessed over 4,000 jeeps, with hundreds more arriving daily aboard the endless stream of supply ships. This number seemed impossible to German officers who could remember the entire German army invading Poland in 1939 with fewer than 3,000 motor vehicles of all types combined. The mathematical implications suggested that the United States could lose every vehicle currently in Normandy and replace them all within 2 weeks of production. Germany, even operating its factories at maximum capacity, could not hope to match such output. The arithmetic of industrial warfare had become a calculation that always favored the Americans regardless of German tactical successes on the battlefield. Colonel Ernst Wagner of Panzer Lehr Division compiled a comprehensive report on American motorization that reached Field Marshal Rommel's headquarters shortly before the Field Marshal was injured in a strafing attack. Wagner's assessment was blunt and professionally devastating. German forces faced an enemy who had industrialized warfare to a degree that exceeded anything German planners had imagined possible. The Americans mass-produced military vehicles using the same assembly line methods they had developed for manufacturing civilian automobiles in peacetime. Every American soldier seemed to know how to drive and perform basic vehicle maintenance as a matter of ordinary education. American society as a whole was mobilized for mechanized warfare in a way that German society had never achieved despite years of preparation. The war was being decided not on battlefields but in factories, and Germany was losing that industrial contest decisively. The fundamental disparity in production philosophy proved impossible to bridge through any amount of tactical skill or operational excellence. German vehicles like the Kübelwagen were products of careful engineering, constructed with attention to quality and designed for extended service lives. German automotive tradition emphasized durability and repairability, but Germany could produce only a few dozen such vehicles per day, even at peak manufacturing rates. American Jeeps were simple in design, crude by German engineering standards, but emerged from assembly lines at rates that Germany could not match even if it dedicated all its factories to vehicle production exclusively. Where German industry sought perfection in individual products, American industry sought adequacy multiplied by overwhelming numbers. The difference in philosophy reflected deeper cultural assumptions about the nature of warfare and the relationship between industrial capacity and military power. General Major Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, considered one of the German Army's elite formations, yet even this skilled and experienced officer found himself struggling against American material superiority. Bayerlein provided a stark assessment that captured the essential problem confronting German forces. Germany was fighting the last war while the Americans fought the next one. German forces worked to perfect individual vehicles, while Americans perfected the system that produced vehicles in unlimited quantities. Germany trained specialist mechanics capable of performing miracles of improvisation, while Americans designed vehicles that any soldier with basic training could maintain. The metaphor Bayerlein employed was particularly apt. German forces were artisans fighting an assembly line, and the assembly line was winning through sheer volume rather than individual excellence. The redundancy built into the American system frustrated every attempt at effective German tactical planning. Destroying a bridge to halt American supply columns proved futile when engineer units appeared within hours, carrying portable bridging equipment transported on jeeps. Ambushing reconnaissance patrols achieved little lasting effect when identical replacement vehicles and newly assigned crews appeared to continue the mission as if nothing had happened. Mining roads only caused Americans to abandon those routes and drive through fields instead. Every German tactical success, no matter how professionally executed, was negated by American material abundance. The traditional military concept of attrition, of gradually degrading enemy capabilities through accumulated losses, ceased to function when the enemy possessed unlimited capacity to replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. The Jeep gradually became a symbol of American abundance that transcended its purely military function. German soldiers reported seeing jeeps employed for tasks that would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht, where every vehicle was precious and carefully allocated to essential missions. Americans used jeeps to deliver mail to frontline positions. They transported journalists and photographers. They carried chaplains to conduct religious services for forward units. They moved personal baggage for officers who seemed to travel with luxuries German soldiers hadn't seen in years. This casual employment of military equipment for convenience rather than strict necessity demonstrated a wealth of resources that German soldiers, long accustomed to scarcity and the careful preservation of every asset, found simultaneously amazing and demoralizing. Lieutenant Friedrich Hoffmann attempted to explain this phenomenon to his family in a letter that was intercepted and never delivered. Hoffmann wrote that the Americans used their vehicles the way German soldiers used bicycles, for everything and anything without particular concern for wear or conservation of resources. He described witnessing a jeep being employed to deliver hot food to a single isolated outpost, a journey that consumed fuel and added wear to the vehicle's engine for the comfort of just 3 men. In the German army, those men would have walked to collect their rations and eaten them cold if necessary. This apparent wastefulness should represent a weakness in military efficiency, yet when one possessed resources sufficient to waste without consequence, wastefulness itself became a form of strength that could not be countered through conservation. The technological advantages appeared in unexpected details that accumulated to create overwhelming operational superiority. American jeeps arrived equipped with standardized toolkits containing every tool necessary for field maintenance. Comprehensive maintenance manuals were printed on waterproof paper and issued with every vehicle, enabling even inexperienced mechanics to perform repairs by following detailed instructions. Spare parts packages were calculated through statistical analysis of failure rates and pre-positioned where they would be needed. German vehicles often lacked even basic tools, forcing mechanics to improvise or share scarce equipment between units. Maintenance procedures relied on mechanics' experience and knowledge rather than documentation. Spare parts competed for allocation through a complex requisition system that could require weeks to process requests, even for critical components. As June transitioned into July, German forces found themselves increasingly unable to compete with American mobility advantages. Static defensive positions, no matter how well prepared or stubbornly defended, were simply outflanked by jeep-mounted reconnaissance units that identified weak points and called in forces to exploit them. Artillery positions that should have been protected by distance and terrain were overrun by rapidly advancing motorized infantry that covered ground faster than German commanders thought possible. Supply lines were cut by fast-moving raiding parties that appeared behind German lines, struck their targets, and disappeared before reserves could be organized to respond. The battlefield had become fluid in ways that systematically favored the side with unlimited motorized equipment available for every tactical requirement. Major Wilhelm von Steuben, observing American preparations for the breakout operation planned for late July, recorded observations that captured the revolution in warfare that American motorization represented. Von Steuben wrote that the Americans had achieved something German military theory had considered impossible: the complete motorization of an entire army regardless of size. Every soldier could be moved by vehicle rather than marching on foot. Every artillery piece could be towed at highway speeds rather than crawling along at the pace of horse teams. Every supply item could be delivered directly to the unit that needed it, rather than being dumped at centralized depots for soldiers to collect on foot. Germany was fighting a 19th-century war, still dependent on horses and human muscle power for much of its logistics, against an enemy conducting a fully 20th-century mechanized campaign. German high command attempts to counter American motorization proved futile, regardless of the resources allocated to the effort. Orders to prioritize targeting vehicle concentrations were meaningless when vehicles were distributed everywhere throughout American positions rather than concentrated in vulnerable parks. Efforts to interdict supply lines failed when every combat unit possessed organic transportation sufficient to maintain itself independently for extended periods. Plans to exploit American dependence on fuel supplies were negated by a logistics system that delivered gasoline in quantities Germany hadn't seen since its own offensive operations in 1940, when French fuel stocks were captured intact. No tactical expedient could compensate for the fundamental disparity in industrial capacity and logistical capability. By the time Operation Cobra commenced in late July, marking the American breakout from the Normandy beachhead, American forces deployed in the theatre possessed over 15,000 vehicles, with jeeps comprising the single largest category in this mechanized fleet. German intelligence estimates, compiled from prisoner interrogations and aerial reconnaissance photography, suggested that Americans could sustain 50% vehicle losses and still remain more thoroughly motorized than any German division operating at full authorized strength. When this calculation reached Berlin through normal reporting channels, it was dismissed as defeatist exaggeration by staff officers who could not comprehend such abundance. The intelligence estimate was actually conservative, underestimating rather than exaggerating American vehicle strength and replacement capacity. The broader influence of American motorization extended far beyond its immediate military impact on the Normandy campaign. German officers who survived the war and returned to civilian life carried these lessons into the reconstruction of post-war Germany. The American model of standardization, mass production through assembly line techniques, and design philosophy emphasizing simplicity and ease of maintenance over aesthetic elegance would profoundly influence German industrial development in the decades that followed. The Volkswagen, which had failed as the Kübelwagen to compete effectively with the Jeep during wartime, would succeed spectacularly as the Beetle in peacetime by applying the mass production principles that Americans had demonstrated so devastatingly on the battlefield. German industry would rebuild itself according to lessons learned through military defeat. Feldwebel Otto Schultz spent 3 years as a prisoner of war in the United States following his capture in the autumn of 1944. This extended exposure to American society and industrial capacity provided perspective that most German soldiers never gained. Schultz later reflected that in Normandy, German forces learned that modern warfare was not fundamentally about courage, tactical skill, or operational excellence. Those qualities remained important, but were no longer decisive. Modern war had become a contest of industrial capacity, and victory belonged to whichever side could produce the most equipment, ship it the fastest across any distance, and replace battlefield losses immediately without operational pause. The Jeep was not merely a vehicle, but served as a symbol of an entirely new kind of warfare that Germany was not prepared to fight and could not win once the contest was joined. The story of German troops encountering American mass motorization on the Norman beaches and throughout the subsequent campaign represents more than a simple military mismatch between opponents with different levels of equipment. It documents the collision between two fundamentally different civilizations and their contrasting approaches to warfare itself. Germans brought a tradition of professional military excellence stretching back centuries, combined with carefully maintained equipment and conservative logistics that emphasized preservation of scarce resources. Americans brought an industrial system that had transformed warfare into an exercise in mass production and scientific management, where adequate equipment produced in overwhelming quantities trumped superior equipment available in limited numbers. In the final analysis, those endless columns of jeeps that rolled across Normandy throughout the summer of 1944 represented something more profound than military logistics or tactical mobility. They were the physical manifestation of what American propaganda had termed the arsenal of democracy, tangible proof that American industrial might could be projected across oceans and delivered to distant battlefields in quantities that rendered traditional military calculations and careful German planning completely obsolete. For German soldiers watching those columns advance day after day, each individual jeep served as a messenger bearing the same simple but devastating truth. The age of artisan warfare, where skilled professionals using carefully maintained equipment could hope to prevail, had permanently ended. The age of industrial warfare, where factory output determined victory more surely than battlefield courage, had irrevocably begun. Perhaps the final word should belong to Hauptmann Ernst Bergmann, who observed American operations throughout the entire Normandy campaign, from the initial landings through the breakout and pursued fighting. Bergmann survived the war and found employment as an automotive engineer in the post-war German economy that arose from the ruins. His perspective combined immediate battlefield experience with subsequent industrial expertise. Bergmann reflected that the Americans taught their enemies that in modern warfare, the factory had become more important than the battlefield itself. American jeeps, arriving in numbers that seemed endless, each one identical and immediately replaceable if destroyed or damaged, demonstrated that warfare had evolved into a branch of industrial production. German soldiers thought of themselves as warriors practicing an ancient and honorable profession. The Americans revealed that soldiers had become simply workers in what Bergmann termed a factory of destruction, and the American factory was infinitely larger, more efficient, and more productive than anything Germany could construct or operate even under the most favorable circumstances imaginable.